Hi there, welcome to Sunday's Indycar. I'm Gordon Ross, and today I'm actually down in the west part of Glasgow. I'm not going to tell you where exactly because I tend to get interference from somewhere or other whenever I tell people my location. Anyway, today's show is not entirely about Brexit, but quite a bit of it is to do with Brexit. As you'll know from reading the blurb at the beginning of the show, there's been a great deal of activity in London recently about Brexit, with 100,000 people taking to the streets around Westminster to demand a second referendum on Brexit. In other words, they want another chance to vote on whatever the deal is that the British government is proposing to ask for. Not unreasonable given the circumstances. The head of UKIP claimed that the BBC was being biased because they only filmed and interviewed people involved in the anti-Brexit march and not involved in the pro-Brexit march. Does this sound familiar? That the BBC ignored the pro-Brexiteers counter-demonstration and didn't interview any of them. Well, there's a bit of a surprise, the BBC being biased about something in England for a change. Well, it makes a change anyway for us, being used to it in Scotland. Anyway, on top of all of that, it now turns out that Britain's Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, for those of you who didn't realise he was a Foreign Secretary, it's now emerged that a conversation was overheard between Boris Johnson and another Foreign Secretary from another EU nation, which I'll not name at the moment. But the general gist of this was they were talking about business and how did business feel in the UK about Brexit, and this other Foreign Secretary was saying, well, there's been a lot of people from big business publishing articles in the paper and demanding that you do something about it, particularly Airbus. And Boris's reaction to that was to say, F business. Basically, he told them to F off in that exact same terminology. And he was very disparaging about every business. In fact, for a Tory Foreign Secretary to ignore and try to ridicule the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI, which is probably one of the most Tory organisations that has ever existed, Boris is just rubbishing that and ignoring them and saying that, you know, Brexit is Brexit, we're going to leave the EU and that's that, nobody gets a say on it. So Boris has been opening his mouth as usual without thinking and revealing his entire position as a hard Brexiteer. He's really challenging Theresa May and the business world in the UK to just shut up. He's basically telling them he's going to ignore them and sending a very clear signal to Europe from the Foreign Secretary that Britain intends to just simply leave the EU either with a good deal, which they are going to try and muscle out of the EU by threatening not to pay their divorce bill, or if there isn't a great deal for Britain forthcoming and it's not a good deal, to simply walk away from the EU completely on the 29th of March. Now, the likelihood of either of those things happening, nobody knows, because we don't know what the soft Brexiteers among the Tory party are actually preparing in terms of a Brexit deal. But the fact that they're warning about the Brexit, not the dividend, but the Brexit disaster for jobs already, is somewhat preparing the ground for what will be probably an economic and industrial catastrophe on the scale of the 1980s, when every business, nationalised business in the UK, was sold off, closed down and dismantled by the Tories in another one of their fits of ideological mania that they tend to go through now and again. But this, I think, is going to be far worse than even Thatcherism. And because of that, we know that the media is going to ratchet up all the propaganda, the pro-Brexit propaganda, the so-called Brexit Dividend propaganda is going to be spewing out of every television set on every channel to try to convince us that what we're being led into is somehow better than what we've got now. And there's no way of knowing that. But what we do know is that the Airbus industry should manufacture wings at Wharton and also in a plant, I believe, in Wales. I'm not sure if I've got the exact locations correct, but they have two plants, one at Wharton, one in Wales, where they make wings. They have said if there is no transition period then they would think about pulling out of both England and Wales and manufacturing their wings on the continent. Now, this is not to say, they're not saying if there's no Brexit deal, they're saying if there's no transition period. That's not even a Brexit deal. That means they're saying if the British government fails to sort out the Northern Irish border, Gibraltar, and the European citizens' rights to stay here to the satisfaction of the EU, if it's not done, and that is coming up on the 28th of this month, by the way, then Airbus will leave the United Kingdom and make its wings elsewhere. Now, it's not an unreasonable thing for them to do, because in the event of a sudden Brexit, they are going to have pre-ordered and bought in years and years and years worth of components and warehoused them somewhere so that they can continue wing production through the whole period of chaos when everybody's having to pay and watch things going through customs and wait for delays and so on and so on. They would have to build new warehousing, they'd have to stockpile millions and millions of components, pieces of aeroplanes would need to be stockpiled all over the UK. It would be a total mess. So the risk here is not so much about there not being a Brexit deal, but the risk here is about there being no transition deal, which is just the 2-year period where Britain stays in the EU while it kind of sorts itself out. If the Airbus industries are saying that the transition deal is a deal breaker, if Britain gets Ireland wrong and gets Gibraltar wrong and gets European nationals living in the UK, if they get all of that wrong or even one of those things wrong, and the EU says no, we're not going ahead with talks and there won't be a transition period, Airbus will just simply up sticks and go. And it's estimated that somewhere in the region of 100,000 jobs in England and Wales are either directly or indirectly linked to Airbus Industries in their plant in the UK. It's 100,000 jobs at risk if they get the Irish question wrong. Yesterday I read a report from a woman who used to be a reporter for the BBC, and she used to travel down from Scotland, from reporting Scotland, down to Westminster to report on what was happening there. And she saw terrible things happening, utterly revolting things happening, people being abused, shouted at, racist remarks being hurled across the chamber from both sides of the House at the Scottish MPs. They were treated like second-class citizens. And she wanted to report on this. She wanted to report on the way they were being treated, but the BBC said, no, it's just the way it is, ignore it. Don't write about it. If you write about it, there will be consequences. So her job was on the line if she reported any of what was really happening in Westminster to those Scottish MPs. Now she is writing to say that despite the fact that she voted no in the last referendum, she now believes that Brexit and the way that the Scottish people and their representatives are treated in Westminster is now forcing the UK apart. And she believes quite earnestly that Brexit and the continued disaster of Tory leadership and the keeping down of Scotland is going to force the reunification of Ireland and the independence of Scotland, and perhaps even the start of an independence campaign in Wales. It's that bad, and she has changed her mind that much that she now thinks that she would vote for independence, whereas before she was a solid no, but now she's coming out as ex-BBC reporter and blowing the whistle. Now that her job's not at stake, she can tell us that she was forced not to report on the way Scottish MPs were abused and mocked at Westminster. And she was told not to report on the ridiculous nature of some of the traditions in Westminster, the way they carried on, the braying, the catcalls, the whooping, and basically the schoolboy behaviour, because it would embarrass the government, and the BBC would not let her report it. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is we see a massive media campaign to convince us, the Scottish people, that Brexit is not really going to hurt us at all, that we're going to have more money for the NHS. Well, we'll wait and see about that, because the DUP was promised £1 billion, remember, they still haven't seen a red cent of that. What happens with Scotland, I think, is going to be important for us. We have to stop thinking of social media as being a bubble that we operate in. Every time the media come on with a pro-Brexit interview, with a soft interview where they don't ask any awkward questions, and where the Brexiteers get their point across, where the Tories get to say that there's a Brexit dividend and that we're all powerful and it's going to be wonderful, we need somebody on the other side of the media, and I'm talking about social media here, YouTube, Facebook, whatever medium that you work on, people like me to come out and say this is rubbish, this is not the truth. The truth of the matter is this: we are already seeing jobs being lost. We're already seeing inflation creeping further and further up. I've seen fuel in Glasgow now costing almost £1.40 a litre. Nobody's mentioning that. We're seeing the cost of food gradually creeping up as European imports are beginning to get more expensive. The pound beginning to dip. As the pound loses in value, our ability to buy in food and clothing and other things from abroad diminishes, and because inflation is going up and wages are not, we're going to see stagnation, we're going to see job losses, we're going to see a new recession, and that's before Brexit has even started. We've already seen job losses. We've already seen firms migrating to the south. We've seen fish packing companies packing up their bags because they're being offered bribes and inducements to move their operations and centralise in England to the cost of Scottish workers. There are good news stories, of course, and I've been mentioning ones like what's happening with Ferguson Marine Engineering, where they're about to build the very first hydrogen-powered car ferries, using hydrogen generated by tidal energy in the north of Scotland. So we have entirely green shipping, something which has never been done before. Groundbreaking stuff coming to Scotland soon. Somebody pointed out to me yesterday, and I had forgotten about it, that Jim McCall, who is the boss of Ferguson Marine Engineering, has put in a bid to buy the graving docks. Those are the dry docks on the other side of the Clyde beside the Science Centre in Govan. The docks haven't been used for about 50 years, but with the gates and the mechanisms replaced, Ferguson Engineering wanted to use them to build and service their ships on the Clyde, civilian ships, and they've put in a planning proposal and they're planning to channel between 12 and 25 million pounds into developing those docks back into working dry docks, which would give Glasgow workers and shipyard workers something to cheer about again. No longer making warships, but actually building and repairing civilian ships that have been designed and built here using cutting-edge propulsion technology, using green fuels. All of that could be happening. But the City Council and the people who own the docks at the moment want to build housing on it, which I think is a huge mistake. For a dry dock system which still would function, to be filled in and just to have cheap housing built on it would be a colossal mistake. So there are good things that can happen in Scotland, but we have to be on our toes. The media campaign's already swung into full steam ahead with Brexit. Everything Brexit is going to be good according to the Tories. The media is taking an opposite view now. I noticed the BBC are going very much anti-Brexit in their coverage in England, but up here, not so much. So what we now have to do is just wait to see what happens on the 28th, which is only a couple of days' time in Ireland, and we'll know for sure whether wing manufacturing in England and Wales is going to continue or not, because if they don't pull off a miracle in Ireland, then Airbus and Airbus wings will just move to Europe, and that will be the end of 100,000 jobs in England and Wales at a stroke, just because they can't sort out the border of Ireland. So let's wait and see what happens next. Ireland is a critical stumbling block for the Tories, but this is a golden opportunity for people who live in both sides of the Irish border to get together again and to reunify the island. And for England, because it is England in fact, who originally took over Ireland by force, and it was won back by force in 1922, but they held on to these 6 counties in Northern Ireland like a stubborn little pocket of infection, and they're still there. And I think Ireland would probably be a price that the Tories would say is worth paying in order to maintain 100,000 jobs in England, which are at stake if they get the Irish border issue wrong. And the obvious answer to the Irish border problem is to make Ireland one united country again. the whole Republic of Ireland could then stay in the EU and everybody would be fine. Their jobs would be safe, their trade would be safe, and the wing building for Airbus would stay in England and Wales, at least for the time being. So that's the stakes we're talking about at the moment. That's how bad it has got, and it's going to get worse. People are going to see a lot worse things beginning to happen just before we Brexit. The British government has until October to produce their white paper on what exactly they are planning to ask for in the Brexit deal. We'll then hear a response from the European Union about what they feel is possible and whether what is being asked for is in any way a reasonable thing for them to give. But the rhetoric coming out of the Tory party and its right-wingers is no Brexit is better than a bad Brexit, and we're going to take all of our divorce money away from you and not pay you unless we get a good deal. They're being already they're starting to threaten the EU by withdrawing the money which they owe. Actually, Britain owes Europe these billions of pounds for projects that it said it would pay for, and if they don't pay for them, there will be trouble. Anyway, I have to go now, but I will talk to you later. Have a good Sunday, but watch the news over the next few days, particularly on the 28th, to see what happens in Ireland. I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.